Hello everybody, English 3430. I am here today to talk to you a little bit about some of the reading material we had for today. We're going to talk about Mary Oliver Poetry Handbook and the Poetry Home Repair Manual by Ted Kooser. So what I want to do with this one is just chat with you a little bit about some of the stuff from the textbook and just kind of open the discussion. And then you can make comments and ask questions below, and we can further our discussion in that fashion. But I thought I'd just talk a little bit about it, read some things out loud, and just kind of focus on what I was most drawn to with this section, and then you can contribute with your thoughts as well. So as I stated earlier in the discussion thread that I also posted, that one is different from this one because I was wearing a sweater in that one, and now I'm not. Completely different. If I have to post something third, I will take the tie off, but I'm not taking the tie off yet. It's early in the day for me. I wanted to start off by talking about the section, chapter 5 in the Poetry Home Repair Manual. It begins on page 45. What I wanted you to read for today was 45 to 54. I had my pages off by a little bit in the syllabus. I apologize for that, but the stuff I needed you to read, you would have read. And the stuff that you would have read if you followed that by the letter is pretty interesting, and we'll talk about it in a couple weeks. So you got ahead of the game. And when you read it again, you'll think, oh yeah, I remember that. Jason was really smart to accidentally make me read those 3 pages before I needed to. So the section, chapter 5 here, is called Rhyming Ham Cubes Prose Poems. And again, we're on page 45. And he includes an interesting poem at the beginning by Edward Weissmussel. It's called Seahorse. And I want to read it. I'm just read it out loud. I don't know if you did. If you did, well, then you'll hear it again, this time by somebody who's not you. But I think it's important to listen to poems like this, and we'll do this a lot with these sections. I won't necessarily read a ton of the text that they wrote, although I'll do that at times. But mostly I want to listen to some of these poems, and so we can hear them. So, Seahorse. You might think it would leap the waves in a white fire of foam, racing eyes mad with what might be delight, a runaway, or loosed from a god's team, galloping in its vast pasture. But this one was the size of a brooch, thin and red gold and still. The children had sent for it from the Atlantic. It arrived by air in a pouch of seawater, containing all it needed to sustain life as it crossed the continent. Following instructions, we made it a small, nourishing ocean, in which it anchored itself upright to a strand of seaweed, and, staring jewel-eyed at nothing, slowly faded white and died. Now, what Kooser talks about is that isn't a poem that is calling a lot of attention to the rhyme in it. In fact, as he says, and this is probably true, you couldn't hear it. As I was reading it aloud, I was listening for the rhyme because I knew what I was about to talk about, but I didn't sense it in a way that is generally present when you have end-stopped rhyming words at the end of lines, which is something that we'll talk about in the Mary Oliver section, and other things beyond that. A lot of you have already told me or insinuated to me that you like rhyming. Cool. Rhyming is an integral part of what poetry has been for hundreds of years, in English and otherwise. So rhyme is a thing that we hold to a very high standard in poetry. As we're reading through more contemporary work, a lot of it doesn't rhyme. You know, when we're reading through the poems in Mary Oliver's book that we'll look at in a few weeks, when we're reading through things that I've shown you that are more contemporary, we don't see a lot of rhyme. We saw a lot of rhyme in the older stuff, but we don't see a lot of rhyme elsewhere. Sometimes when we see rhyme, we might see it in the way that we see it in this Weissmuller poem, which is rhyme that is not dictating the direction of the poem. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But when you're writing your own poems for us in here, if you're rhyming, that's okay. Be prepared for me to talk about rhyme. And I don't want to stop you. I want you to write what you want to write, no matter what it is. And sometimes I get a reputation with students in previous classes that I don't like rhyming. I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's true. I think that rhyming in a poem can work very effectively, but sometimes we end up letting the rhyme dictate the direction of the poem, that we are so focused on maintaining a very specific rhyme scheme that we end up using word choices that don't really make sense and affect the integrity of the poem. What Weissmuller's doing here is he's getting rhyme, but it's working often internally. It's working in ways that are not calling attention to it. It's nestled inside, to use Kooser's language, nestled inside conversational language. Let's look at it again. We'll read on page 46, where now Kuser has highlighted the rhyming words, and we can hear it if I accentuate it. Now I'm reading it in a way that is not natural. And so when I read this first stanza in an unnatural way, obviously we're hitting the rhyme, but we wouldn't hear it elsewhere. So you might think it would leap the waves in a white fire of foam racing, eyes mad with what might be delight. Obviously you don't read it that way. But you're hearing that rhyme when you accentuate it in this fashion. Now, the question is, if you're somebody who's very attached to rhyme, you might think, well, yeah, but rhyme is delightful. Rhyme is something that can grab the reader's ear, that can pull the reader in. It's something that can be charming and provocative and do all these things. But you got to put it at the end of lines, or you got to put it in the middle and the end of lines, so you can really hear that musicality through the line come through in the way that Oliver's going to talk about. If you're just hiding it in the way this Weissmuller poem is, what's the point? What's the point? What's the point? Why do it in the way that Weissmuller is doing it? If you're going to use rhyme, why not hit it in such a way that the reader can't help but hear it, that the reader is drawn to it by the ear and is pulled in? What is happening with the Weissmuller poem that makes it a benefit to the poem to have it embedded in the conversational language, as Kuser says? Well, I think that's a really good point. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. I think one of the main things that's happening here is that it's creating musicality without dictating the tempo and the direction of the poem, which sometimes a rhyme can do. Sometimes when you have a rhyming poem, it just feels like it's a rhyming poem and it doesn't feel like anything else. That all of the linguistic tools that are being used, all of the rhythms and all of the pacing are all contributing just to get to the rhyme. That's going to be at the end, the rhyming word that'll appear at the end of a line. Here, Weissmuller is doing something interesting, which is creating a musicality to the line without making it overwhelm the line. I mean, listen to it again. I know, it's the third time I'm reading it to you. But listen to it again thinking about those rhyming words. I'm not going to hit them in this first stanza in the same way that I did before. But hear how they're still creating a music. You might think it would leap the waves in a white fire of foam racing, eyes mad with what might be delight. I'm still hitting those IGT sounds and those ITE sounds. I'm still doing it. But it's not obtrusive, and it's adding a rhythm. It's adding a pattern of flow. You might think it would leap the waves in a white fire of foam, racing eyes mad with what might be delight. There's a rhythm, there's a pacing there, but it's not focusing everything on the rhyme. So I think this is something that's kind of interesting for us to do. You can make the poems move, you can make the poems dance without hitting those end lines in those ways. And I think that that's a really important and interesting thing to do. Now, in this section, Kuser talks about a variety of different types of styles. He talks about rhyming, he focuses on it in that way. He talks a little bit about different kinds of forms, villanelles and sestinas. We can talk a little bit about those as we go on. We're going to have a section that we'll talk more about it from Oliver's book. Villanelles and sestinas, they are just forms of poetry that have very fixed styles. A lot of poets are very interested in writing in formal ways. The sonnet. I mean, what do we know about a sonnet? We know sonnets, right? We've taken enough literature classes in our lives to know what a sonnet is. What do we know about a sonnet? What is it that defines a sonnet? This would be a point if I was in a class, you would be saying something, but you're not. So I'm asking questions that require responses, but I can't get them. So I'll tell you what makes for a sonnet. There's certain things that happen in them. Sometimes it's a very, very strict rhyme scheme. Sometimes it is. Though in contemporary sonnets, not so much. Generally, in a sonnet, especially with some of the classic sonnets we've seen, there's a turn that occurs. Sometimes that turn in a formal sonnet occurs about line 8. And what I mean by turn is it feels like it's moving in one direction, and then it does something that kind of changes the direction of the poem around line 8. Sometimes the turn happens about line 12. Often there's a concluding couplet, rhyming couplet generally, that changes the entire tone and pace of the direction that the poem has taken. So we think the poem has gone in one direction, then we get to that last couplet and like, oh, there's a turn. Things have changed. One thing that's always present in a sonnet seems to be how many lines it is. And how many lines is it? I know you're answering this, even if I can't hear you. I think I can hear you. It's 14, right? 14 lines is a sonnet. That feels like a rule that we can't really break. But there's a lot of different patterns and rhythms and styles, but that's what a sonnet is. Then there's a sestina. A sestina is a very intricate poem that has 6 repeating words that are always at the end of certain lines. We can talk more about it. I can show you examples. But there are these 6 words. They are the end words of each line. They don't have to rhyme. They don't have to do anything, but they have to be present. And so you have a certain number. You have 6 stanzas and then a concluding 3-line stanza. And at the end of each of those first 6 stanzas, the end of each line should be one of those words rotated in a specific, mentioned in a specific way and then rotated throughout. So you'd have your first 6 lines would have the words in one order, and then the next 6 lines would have the words rotated in a different order, and it's very specific, and we can talk about that later. And then the last 3 lines would contain all 6 of them, 2 in each line. It's really structured. It's really interesting. The Villanelle is an 18-line poem that has entire lines that get repeated throughout. But again, with our contemporary look at things, we vary and can make modifications as we feel fit. One of the things that I love about these different forms, and I've tried them, I've spent a lot of time writing different formal poems. It's almost like it's a challenge that you kind of get yourself into a box and then you try to write your way out of it. It's an exercise. This is a piece of advice that a professor gave me once that I love passing down to you because I think it's the most important thing we can think of when it comes to writing our own work. Each poem that you write is as important as the next poem that you write. I want you to think about the things that you're writing as a journey. So let's say you decide to take on writing a sestina, or you're feeling really crazy and you decide to take on a villanelle, or you decide that you don't like yourself at all and you want to write a sestina. You take those on, and maybe on their own they're not going to be great. There are very few attempts at formal poetry that end up really, really rocking. But it's testing you, it's teaching you something, it's moving you in a direction where you can be more comfortable with these forms later on. So I think that when you are looking at formal structures like that, it is helping us make that move to our next poem. Now, when we say that each poem is only as important as the next poem, that doesn't mean that you don't have some poems along the way that are objectively better. Right? That happens. That maybe I write a poem along the way and one of them's like really good. And then the one that follows that maybe isn't as good as that one that came before it, but is still contributing to it. But that's something that I think is important for us when we are trying to write formally, is that it's all part of a journey. And these challenges of writing ourselves into boxes such as it is really help us with that journey as we go forward. Another thing that Kuser has on here in this section is talking about prose poems. And a prose poem is a poem that, as you can guess, is written not in the expected way of having line breaks and lines, which we'll talk about with Oliver in a minute, but is instead written in a prose block. It is something that is structured in a way that it feels like a paragraph. And remember when we were talking about poetry at the beginning of the semester, we talked about how something is a poem unless it doesn't have that thing, right? Like a poem needs to have lines unless it doesn't. And when it comes to a prose poem, it really doesn't have lines, but it's still creating a poetic experience. That's one of the things I love about one of the things I love about poetry is it feels like you can get away with a lot. There's a lot of things that we can do that challenge what's expected. And I think that that's a wonderful freeing feeling when you can do that. So a prose poem can feel like an excerpt from a story. It can have a narrative structure. It can get some things across. Or it can feel like just a sketch in a way. It's not going to be developed enough to feel like a short story, but it might feel like a very, very short one. There's this sort of fine line between a prose poem and a piece of flash fiction. If you don't know what flash fiction is, this is short fiction that is generally less than 750 words, and sometimes much, much less than that even. Which, who cares? If it's good, if it's interesting, it's compelling, then it doesn't matter. But prose poems can be really, really compelling as they go on. I'm going to see if I can find something. I'm here. I can hear you. I mean, I can't hear you, but I know we're there somewhere. It looks like I'm not going to, the book that I'm reaching for does not seem to be behind me here. unfortunately not. But I'll track it down. There's some prose poems that I'd like to share with you as we go on that I think will be compelling. Maybe next week in class, if I can't find it here, I'll read it to you and we can get into it. Or I'll share it below. But prose poems are poems. Anything can be a poem. I mean, it's one of the beautiful things about it, even if a prose poem doesn't have the line. And the line is what we talk about in Mary Oliver's section for this week on page 35. And Oliver is talking about very difficult stuff, very technical stuff, in a way that I think is accessible, if not still a little bit challenging. It's also very technical with lots and lots of terminology. And, we'll talk about different iambs and trochees and dactyls and anapests and spondees. And I think knowing those terms by name is helpful in understanding how they function and how they work. I also think that knowing what they do is more important than identifying them. And what's important about them is that there are different patterns that we explore when we're writing something in a line, in a structured formal line. Now, I am not going to require you, if you do it, I'm not stopping you, but I'm not going to require you to write a poem that is following the very structured metrical vision that is talked about in this book. If you wanted to write 100 lines of blank verse, go for it. I'm not going to require it here. But what I am going to do is make sure that we talk about it as we go on. And I'll read a little bit of it, of what she's talking about here, because I think it's useful. But the first obvious difference, she says on page 35, between prose and poetry is that prose is printed or written within the confines of margins. Again, that's what a prose poem is. That's why it gets complicated for us. While poetry is written in lines that do not necessarily pay attention to the margins, especially the right margin, unless it doesn't, right? Well, we've already established that. So what is being said here is that a poem is going to pay attention to the left margin, though it doesn't always, but it is going to pay less attention to the right margin, which is more consistent, unless, of course, we're talking about a prose poem. The word verse derives from the Latin and carries the meaning to turn, as in verses. Poets today, who do not often write in the given form, such as sonnets, need to understand what effects are created by turning of the line at any of the various possible points, and thus breaking a logical phrase, or only at the conclusion of sentences or at the conclusion of logical units, etc. So what she's talking about with the breaking of a line is that this is when we stop a line. And we have to understand as writers why we're doing it. What is causing us to stop at a certain point? Now, for some of the poets from long ago, that would be determined by very specific decisions in terms of how many meters. Like, this was going to be a line that was going to have 5 feet, so that's when it had to stop. This was going to be an iambic pentameter line when I got to the 10th syllable, and maybe it had a rhyme, maybe it didn't, but it was going to end at that point, and that's where we were going to go. For poets today, if we're not doing that, and I don't generally, I don't think a lot about dactyls or trochees or anything like that when I'm writing. I just don't. I know what they mean and I know what they do, and sometimes I play around with changing up my sound patterns in a poem, but I don't spend a lot of time counting syllables. I just don't. But it's important to make sure that you understand, even when you're not doing that, where you're breaking a line, where those lines are supposed to stop, and why they're stopping at those particular moments and spaces. Maybe it's because there's a really important word you want to linger on. I think one thing that I like to think about with lines is that every single line in a poem should do something. It should accomplish something. Even when it's very short, it should accomplish something. I want you to think about each line as existing unto itself and existing in a way that it's contributing to the overall conversation that the poem is having. I think it's also important for us to think about the last word in a line as being in some ways the most important word of the line. And maybe the second most important word is the first word of the line. If we're thinking of each line as individual, it's not, because it's contributing to everything else that's in the poem and requires the rest of the poem to prop it up. But if we think about each line doing something, contributing something, we really want each line to be good. And so you want the last word of each line to pop, to contribute, to give us something. When you are reading a poem and the lines are broken and the last word of each line is something like of, and it's not flowing very well. When we read a poem, we're reading it so that we linger just for a little bit longer than we need to on each line. You don't overemphasize that generally, but we kind of linger on it a bit. So I hit that last word just a little bit more. I'm thinking about it as I transition in to the next line. So even if it's not a poem that's written in formal structure, I'm still thinking a little bit about the way that I'm moving from one point to the next point as we go on. So that's important. It's as she says, it's the idea of when to turn the line is something that every poet deals with throughout his or her working life. Gladly too. It's fun, really. We're going to spend a ton of time talking about line breaks and where poems can break on their lines and what we can do. I think that I will post something a little bit later that we can play around with. There are things that we can do, exercises that we can do, and ways of thinking about it. A poem becomes very different based on where those line breaks occur. Even when it's a poem that is in and of itself not formal, not structured, not dependent on rhyme, where we decide to break those lines changes everything. It tells a different story. If you've got a poem that has almost entirely short lines, or maybe some really short lines and some long ones, there's a indication of an erratic nature to the speaker that we wouldn't get if everything was very similar going down the way. If every line is super short, it's maybe choppier as we go through. If everything is really, really long, maybe it feels more long-winded and windier. This is all dependent upon how we break something. So one single poem can feel like a dozen different poems if we break the lines in a dozen different ways. So as she talks about this, she's talking about more formal structure in a lot of this. So let's talk about metrical verse on 36. In metrical verse, each line of the poem can be divided into feet, and each foot into stresses, syllable sounds, to reveal the overall rhythmic pattern. The process of dividing a line into metrical feet and each foot into its individual parts is called scansion. When we're scanning a line, we are breaking it down to hear the rhythm and hear the different patterns. An iamb, or an iambic foot, is one light stress followed by one heavy stress. And she mentions it in here, but the way that we follow that is these symbols here. This is how we look at an iambic word. Upon. Upon is an iamb. It is a light stress followed by a heavy stress, upon. Maybe you're trying to figure out how this is working. You look at it and think, okay, well, that's what she's saying, that's what Jason's saying. What does that mean? We'll switch it. What if we put the stress on the first part of the word and not the second? What does it sound like? Upon is what it is now, right? I'm not emphasizing up, I'm emphasizing on. If it's up on, do we say that? Well, it's up on a time. Not usually. It sounds cool though. I think I'm going to start. So that's how that works, right? It's something that is subtle. This is supposed to, iambic pentameter lines. Those are the unstressed followed by the stress and 5 iambic feet strung together. That's an iambic pentameter line. That's what most of Shakespeare is written in. That's what most of some of the classic literature, classic English poetry is written in. This is supposed to capture normal speech. That we're supposed to talk in a way in normal speech that sort of captures the cadences of iambic pentameter. Is that true? Well, kind of, a little bit. We probably have this tendency to talk in this fashion. And I don't want anybody to scan what I'm saying now. Please stop, please stop. But it's something that feels more natural. But she gives us lines that we can practice this. Upon these boughs which shake against the cold. I'm not reading this in any dramatically different way. I'm reading it in the normal way that I would read something, and you can hear how those words are happening upon. We've already established, right? I'm hitting on. This is not dramatic. I'm not saying upon, but even when I say that way, that doesn't sound as weird as up on, right? Because it's capturing normal speech. Those boughs. I'm not hitting those boughs. I'm hitting those boughs. Which shake. Shake. I'm lingering on shake a little bit more. Against. I mean, this is just how we say this word, against something. The cold. See? This is iambic feet strung together, creating an iambic pentameter line, unstressed followed by stressed, upon those boughs which shake against the cold. It's simple. It's the most widely used line in English metrical verse. It's the sonnet line. It's the line of Paradise Lost, of Shakespeare's plays and sonnets, of the Prelude by Wordsworth. It's also the line of many American poems, including those of Robert Frost. This is the line that traditionally gets used, but it's not the only line that we see. And she then gives us a list of other styles of lines. You can have a 1 foot line, a 2 foot line, a 3 foot line, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They get out of control when you get too long. They get kind of choppy, as we've said before, when they're really short. But you can do any of this stuff, and it's liberating to know that you can. Also, we have metrical feet and symbols. Iamb, as we've already talked about, is a light stress followed by a heavy one. A trochee is a heavy stress followed by a light. She gives us examples of all this as we go. A dactyl is a heavy stress followed by 2 light stresses. An anapest is 2 light stresses followed by a heavy stress, and a spondee is 2 equal stresses. So she then proceeds on page 38 to give us a number of familiar pentameter lines. These are lines that typically are going to be written in iambs as well. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell. John Keats to a nightingale. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The shattered water made a misty din. Great waves looked over others coming in. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. Just, again, you listen to it, you say it out loud, and you kind of see these patterns as you go. She also then supplies tetrameter lines, each containing 4 light and 4 heavy stresses. So these are 4 foot lines. The iambic lines were 5. Do they sound different? Let's find out. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills. It does, right? It speeds up. You can hear the acceleration of the line. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. That feels different than the shattered water made a misty din. Great waves looked over others coming in. It feels just consciously different because it's shorter. It's accelerating things. That gets even more heightened when we get to the 3 foot lines, the trimeter lines. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. That's Theodore Roethke's My Papa's Waltz. You can see how this is changing, right? This is what happens when we start accelerating the line. This is true when we have formal lines. This is true when we're dealing with shorter lines overall. Let's hear it again. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. This is being contributed in no small part by the length of the feet in the line. On the other side of the 5 foot line lies the Alexandrine, the longer lines. Awake, arise, my love, and fearless be, for over the southern moors I have a home for thee. This is longer. It feels more winding. It languishes in a way that, like that Roethke, the Whiskey on Your Breath poem, doesn't languish. It doesn't. There's an urgency. There's an adrenaline rush that almost comes through a poem like that. And this is something that is so important as we're going through this, is that we really need to make sure that we feel these things. Now, on 44, she talks about variation. This is where the interesting stuff happens. It's when we have a very standard setup of a line, but then we mix it up and we vary it and we play around with some of the formal structure. That everything seems to be working in a certain way, and then I change it. And that becomes interesting, and she plays around with that. It shows us poets to play around with that in that section, and that's worth looking at. The one more line on 46, the restrained outburst from Keats. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. The opening line of Keats' sonnet might also call for some spondee replacement of the iambic pentameter. Remember, a spondee is 2 equally stressed lines. Ping pong is a spondee, which needs to be used more often, right? Bright star. Does it feel like bright star? I mean, it could be iambic, bright star, but that's not really how we often read it. We would read it as bright star, equal. And starting with the spondee in that fashion kind of starts us off with something that's really striking. Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. Although then she argues maybe the whole thing is a bunch of spondees, because it feels like everything has the same level of adrenaline and energy going through it. It's not bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art. It doesn't feel like that. It feels more like I'm rushing through it with this great burst of energy. And when we do it that way, it really ends up feeling like there's a lot happening and a lot going on with it. So I want to kind of leave it here, and I want to open up for some discussions and thoughts on this section of this book, and obviously what's in the Kuser book as well. But so much depends upon the pacing of a line, the rhythm of a line, and the style of it. Even if we're not going to write in a lot of rhyming structures, which we may or may not. That's totally up to you. But you can see from what Oliver has talked to us about that there's a lot of variation that can come up. There are probably questions that you have about certain things that are in here, or comments. Please post them below. I'll jump in and come up with some thoughts too. But yeah, go through the Poetry Handbook again. I'm sorry I couldn't find that prose poem that I wanted to find. I'll track it down later. I also have an activity that I'd like to share with you, and I'll post that up later today too. Thanks, everybody, and I look forward to talking to you about the line.